So, James Chater, welcome to FORTE podcast. It's a privilege to have you here, sitting here from all the way from Taiwan.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a funny story how we met.
Yes.
Because you were a contributor to Times Radio.
Yes.
Keeping us up to date on the ground in Taiwan.
Exactly.
I want you just to talk about the background and the story of how you ended up in Taiwan. I think that'd be quite interesting to start off with.
Sure.
When did you move to Taiwan, and what was the story?
I moved there for the first time in 2018, and that was after I'd been studying in the US for a year. And the first time I went there was to study Chinese, and I was only there for about 2 months. And then I went back to the UK to start my master's at Oxford in Chinese studies, and then ended up going back in mid 2019 to study Chinese again. And I initially was only meant to be there for about, I think, 3 or 4 months. And I made the very prescient decision to go back to Taiwan, to delay my master's for a year and go back, because I wanted to freelance for a bit and carry on learning Chinese so I could kind of use it in a professional context with more grace and more ease. I'm not that graceful yet, but I'm getting closer. So I actually moved back there in the first week of 2020, so right before the election in Taiwan, but also right before the pandemic came into our lives. So I ended up staying there pretty much. I always say I'm a kind of baby of the pandemic in Taiwan. My experience of Taiwan is very kind of interconnected with the pandemic and everything that's happened in Taiwan since. So yeah, I was in Taiwan for almost all of 2020, and at that point it's when I really began freelancing. Actually, the first piece I had, my first gig as a freelance foreign correspondent was for the New Statesman when I reported on the election for them. And then in 2021, I was kind of back and forth between Taiwan and the UK and Australia, which is where my dad's from, to partly because I was finishing my master's, went back to finish some exams, that kind of thing. But yeah, and I've moved back there in September last year to start a full-time job at a broadcaster in Taipei. So I've been there now. I got back a few days ago, so I'm finally got rid of the final bit of jet lag. But I've been out there for about 7 or 8 months now for this trip.
Yeah. And when you were studying your master's in Chinese studies, what was the connection with Taiwan? Was there like an exchange program, a collaboration between the two countries, or?
Yeah, I mean, so there was. I mean, that's a long story. That's a very long story. Oxford usually has a kind of connection with Beijing. I ended up, for a host of whole reasons, some of which were my own decision, some of which were kind of forced upon me, ended up going to Taipei to study Chinese. So they ended up having somewhat of a relationship with the university in Taipei, and that's where I ended up studying Chinese. But it kind of, I mean, I've just condensed an extremely long story into 2 sentences. But I mean, I was a key part of that kind of story is that I won't go into the exact details, but it was partly my decision, partly not my decision, basically, to go to Taipei. But now I feel very grateful for having gone there. I think I was able to I mean, operating as a journalist in Taiwan, as I'm sure you can imagine, is much easier than being in China for obvious reasons. So I think I was able to do a lot more kind of freelance work than I might have been able to elsewhere. And it's a really interesting time to be in Taiwan. It's particularly since the pandemic has begun. It's really starting to, I think Taiwan was seen, many people in Taiwan feel that Taiwan was seen properly kind of for the first time as a result of the pandemic for a kind of host of reasons. One of which is, of course, that Taiwan performed very well in the early stages of the pandemic and was able to kind of keep it relatively under control. Some of the other factors are kind of related to China and broader geopolitical things we've seen over the past couple of years, like what we see in Xinjiang. In the UK, I think the Hong Kong protests were a really kind of critical factor in raising people's consciousness about what the Chinese government had become and what they were willing to do to kind of prosecute their what they want. And obviously Taiwan is central to that whole kind of nexus of questions. So it's been a really, really fascinating time to be in that part of the world, for sure.
Yeah. And you mentioned that your first piece was for the New Statesman.
Yes.
In Taiwan.
Yeah.
You were reporting the elections.
Yeah.
That's correct. I mean, that was a freelance piece of work, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So did you know what you were going to do after that? After you submitted your New Statements piece?
As in after it was completed?
After it's completed. That was filed. Well, did you know
Not
what
at
you were gonna
all.
do?
I mean, it was all... I feel quite quietly proud of what I did as a freelancer out there, because being a freelancer is difficult, and it requires tenacity, and a lot of cold emails, a lot of cold pitching, a lot of chasing people down, and the New Statesman, I guess I was in touch with people who worked there because I'd actually done an internship there whilst I was doing my undergrad, so had still had a few connections with people who worked there, but almost everything else I ended up doing was through, as I just mentioned, chasing people down, emails, going up to people in cafes, and kind of tracking people. I ended up kind of writing for The Spectator, a bit for The Guardian, some other Taiwanese publications, and then a few in the States as well. Mm-hmm. And I think they were all kind of just through cold emails, that kind of boots on the ground, pull up your bootstraps kind of approach. Do you find that exciting? Do you find that scary? Living day to day almost as a journalist, not financially, but maybe financially, but financially,
but
as well.
but also I guess living your job day to day.
Yeah, I mean it's a difficult mentality and a difficult situation to be in, because as a freelancer you have to be very clinical and wary of how you're using your time, and you have to be very certain that something that you want to pitch and something you want to do is both has legs, is likely to be published, and is something that you're really interested in and want to report on, because you can find yourself, if you're not careful, spending a lot of time. It's a really difficult balance to strike, because when you pitch something to an editor, you normally have to have a pretty clear sense of what the story is going to be and what your sources are and how you're going to approach it. But that, of course, that's essentially unpaid labor, because you're not paid for that time, but you have to have done a certain amount of work before you ask for your work to be published, and also money. So it's a difficult balance to strike, and I'm grateful for it, because I think I have funny stories as a result of it. I mean, I ended up doing a kind of range of slightly, I think in 10 years time, we'll look back with fondness about some of the jobs I ended up doing to make money, to kind of just get by. And I really was living kind of like cash every month. I would kind of pay, my friend was kind of my landlord, and I would just pay him in cash for my rent at the end of every month. But I ended up doing some quite funny ad hoc jobs. I mean, I taught English to this kind of group of about 10-year-olds once a week. I also I tried to teach music, but I actually wasn't kind of diligent enough in finding pupils, so I never actually ended up doing that. Mm-hmm. But I also appeared in an English language learning app. It was one of those kind of interactive ones where you speak to someone in the screen, and that person was me. And I had to go to this very kind of, it was on the 26th floor of this massive kind of nondescript tower block in the south of Taipei, and dress up as a subway waiter, as a customs official, as a duty-free store clerk, and act out all these scenarios for someone who's pretending to learn English. But it was extremely well paid. Yeah, it was. So that those kind of things, I think it's kind of part of the process of being a freelance journalist, but I kind of look back on them with fondness. Mm-hmm. Now I have a more secure full-time job. Yeah. And
I noticed there's maybe a theme you go back to in your writing is you're quite interested in politics. Has that always been the case?
Not really, actually. I would say, I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that question, I guess. So personally, I guess I've not always been massively interested in politics. I think my family is not one that discusses politics a lot. Yeah. So I think I became more interested in that as I went to university. I guess there was the foundation for that interest was always kind of there, I think, because I always, when I think about why I wanted to go into journalism, and especially being a foreign correspondent or working overseas, which was always how I envisaged or wanted it to be. I never kind of really imagined myself being a journalist necessarily in the UK and reporting on kind of stuff in the UK. And that my desire to do that has always been driven by quite simple motivations, quite unadorned motivations. I'm curious about people and what motivates people, what makes people scared, what obstacles people come up against. And so I think that was always there, even though I didn't come from a family that necessarily was steeped in discussions about politics and geopolitics and all that kind of thing. So I think that came later. That was kind of a more, it just came with with just being there and talking to people and finding out what makes people tick. And the other way to answer that question is that as a foreign correspondent and as someone that is in a place and speaking to people who are elsewhere, you normally have to kind of pick and select stories and find the information that is going to speak to people who are overseas and who don't know anything about this particular place. And in the case of Taiwan, that is just that for a large majority of the journalism and the stories that come out of there is the relationship with China, because it is has a potential to kind of uproot global geopolitics and so much of the way the world is structured today. So I guess that's another reason why a lot of my writing and a lot of the stuff I've done from Taiwan has tended towards politics and geopolitics, because it's kind of what's in demand as well from journalists who are based there. So yeah, I guess that's two ways of answering your question.
I relate to this a lot because as a journalist too, I don't have any strong desire to be a reporter in the UK. It's always stories overseas that really interest me.
Yeah.
Foreign policy, for example, international relations of any kind. And I think that comes down to my personality of wanting to see the world a lot more rather than be confined on this island. And I wondered what your reason was for not wanting to be a correspondent or a reporter in the UK, just in the UK.
Yeah, it's I guess it's related to what I just mentioned, in that it's always been a very, I kind of don't perceive myself as being that very mission driven journalist necessarily. I think I'm just really curious about the world, and it's more simple in a way. It's just I kind of want to see. I'm on this earth for a certain amount of time. I might as well see as much of it as I can. That kind of mentality, as opposed to I don't know. Maybe mission driven isn't the best comparison to give with that, but it is quite a simple desire to just to see and experience as much of the world and as people who are all here at the same time as me as I can.
Yeah.
And I always remember from a very young age, I was very lucky, I guess, in the sense I had parents who were very willing to travel and to take myself and my sister to various places around the world. So my dad's Australian, as I mentioned, so we would travel to Australia a lot of the time. I know it's not very culturally dissimilar from the UK, but we would often stop in Asia, for example, on the way to Australia. So I remember going to Singapore quite a bit when I was younger. My family is obsessed with sport. Obsessed to ad nauseum. And so my mum took us to the Beijing Olympics when I was about 12, I think, at that point. So whilst a lot of the reason we traveled when I was younger was for sport, which I wasn't necessarily that interested in, I was very lucky in that I was able to see a lot of the world, I think, from quite a young age. And so I think I remember always coming home to the UK, something I always would think about as I landed at the airport, or something I would always do, is look at the arrivals list of places and just think, wow, I talk to my friends about this often, and they kind of find it slightly perplexing, but I find airports to be quite enchanting and quite, I don't want to say romantic, because there's something profoundly unromantic about them, but something quite enchanting and quite enchanting is kind of the only word that comes to mind, that we're kind of, this group of people are for a short period of time locked in the same place and will just be flung to different parts of the world in a few hours time. I find that that's kind of similitude of being in the same place at the same time quite fascinating.
You know, I've had that feeling, that sensation. It's only pertains to airports, that feeling, and it can never be replicated anywhere else apart from airports. That's right. It's the feeling, I think, enchantment, yes, that can be a word to describe it. But I also think that hopeful, possibly, because when you're at an airport, especially when you're in your home country's airport, and you're about to jet off to somewhere, and you see all these people from different nationalities come together in this place, there's a sense of coming into contact of the unknown, and also the sense of adventure at the same time.
Definitely.
That sometimes the unknown can be attributed to words like fear and anxiety, but it's not that. It's the feeling of, maybe it's because I don't really feel at home in the UK sometimes. Not sometimes, all the time. I feel that whenever I go on holiday, it feels like there's an opportunity to find home. That's just for me. I'm not sure if you feel that too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's something about the anticipation of you saying that just reminded me of the idea of kind of anticipating being somewhere. There's something kind of always on the cusp about being in an airport. Yeah, I always like kind of prefix that by saying it's environmentally so damaging and so destructive, but there is something quite poetic and quite beautiful about being there. I wonder, I think that there probably, for me as well, there's an element of that. I don't know whether it's not feeling uncomfortable necessarily in the UK, but perhaps it's the idea that I could feel more comfortable somewhere else.
That's a better way to put it.
Yeah. As a kind of a queer person as well, I think growing up anywhere as a queer person is difficult, I think, but the UK happens to be the place that I was born, so perhaps I feel a kind of a motivation to seek out other places. And it's actually interesting. Taiwan is it's a place where I have a whole theory about this, that it's a place where a lot of queer people feel very comfortable. And I think it's because of reasons that portend beyond just it being a place where, you know, Taiwan is, for example, the first place to legalize same-sex marriage in Asia. And legislatively, I think it is more progressive than other places in Asia. But I think it's something more, I think it's something deeper than that, in that I think I kind of view Taiwan as almost like the queer kid of international relations. It's kind of forced into doing things and being things and saying things because everyone else says it has to, even though it kind of feels okay on its own, regardless of any of those other, you know, statements about its own statehood or its own independence and that kind of thing. It just kind of, it is all those things without it having to say so, but it kind of feels like it has to because of the rest of the world. I think there's something quite a peculiar similarity with the experience of a queer person growing up, in feeling that they have to be a certain way or act a certain way, and that the force that necessitates that being very external.
Yeah.
I think it's something that Taiwan experiences on a very macro level, and so I think for that I really empathize with that in a way, and I find it really fascinating. It's something I kind of, now being there for a bit longer and reflect upon, realize this is one of the things I find most interesting about that as a place. This kind of tension between just being and being yourself or being something, and being forced into, being necessitated into defining in relation to a particular concept that someone else says you have to be. But yeah, I need to perhaps write something on my theory of Taiwan as a queer kid of international relations a bit more.
Do you feel more at home in Taiwan or the UK? Does it feel quite weird coming back here?
Now it does a little bit. It does a bit. I think I've constructed and crafted quite a nice life for myself in Taiwan. I think being in Taiwan has coincided with a period of me personally feeling a lot more in my skin and at home with myself as a person. And so sometimes I think coming back now, sometimes it can feel a little bit jarring coming back to the UK. But that said, there are definitely parts of the UK that I miss a lot, and especially being, for example, in London, where we are now. I think coming here is that there is something very exciting about being in London. There's something about the diversity in London, the size, and there's something a bit more unpredictable, I think, about London relative to somewhere like Taipei, which is a bit smaller. I mean, it's still a relatively big international city, but it's quite, I think you can in a much shorter space of time feel like you understand Taipei. And I'm not professing to say that I understand Taipei or Taiwan completely at all, but I think you can feel like you get a handle on that place a little bit faster than you would somewhere like London. So there are parts of it of being in the UK that I miss, but I do feel very at home in Taiwan, and part of it is because of that, the reasons I was just describing.
The watchers of the viewers of this podcast might be wondering why we're in a practice studio when we're both journalists. The reason we're here is because James and I have a very similar background. We both did music as undergraduates. Before I go into that, where was the pivot point where you turned from musician to being a journalist? Was there that pivot point, or was it just a very slow, subtle metamorphosis?
I guess there wasn't a very kind of perpendicular angle, 90-degree turn moment where I said, okay, now I'm going to be a journalist. And I think in a sense, I still view myself in that way, in that I guess you can call me a journalist because the job I do is what most people say is what a journalist does. And for all intents and purposes, I am a journalist, but I kind of slightly recoil still from self-defining in that way, because music, for example, is still such a kind of integral part of my life. And so it's something that is still there and still kind of hovers in the background. It's still, when I'm out, I'm always listening to music. I'm always thinking about music, and it still very much plays a really critical role in kind of my identity and how I kind of think about things, actually. So in a more practical sense, that's a kind of more philosophical, metaphysical way of viewing it. But in a more practical sense, I guess I studied music at university and did student journalism whilst at university. And then I was very fortunate to get a scholarship to go and study at Harvard in the US, which is I applied with the intention of becoming a foreign correspondent. So I think if I have to put a more kind of concrete fork in the road. I guess that was it in a sense, because when I moved to America, I started learning Chinese, for example. I did journalism classes and started reading about kind of global politics, geopolitics in a way that felt more in tune with the role of a journalist and what I wanted to go into, I guess. Mm-hmm. But that said, music still plays a really kind of fundamental role in my life. Mm-hmm. I can't go outside really. I feel quite uncomfortable if I have to walk along a street on my own and not listening to music. Yeah. So it's kind of very much a literal and a kind of figurative soundtrack and backing track to yes. how I navigate the yes. world still.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can see why you would say that, because I think as musicians, when we're learning from a very young age, having instrumental lessons every week, for example, our teachers become very, very important to us in our formative years. They help us not only learn about the music, but also use lessons from the outside world to teach us about music. Yeah. So therefore, during these lessons, we're also learning about life itself. Mm-hmm. That sounds really, really cliche to say, but no, it's a cliche because it's true. Yeah. I think. Through music, I learned how to treat people better. I learned how to appreciate life a lot more and the things that come. So, to, I guess, add to your answer, the reason you recoil a bit to say you're a journalist, because you built yourself in this world via music. So it just feels a bit weird to abandon it.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I feel the same way. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I think in part it's. I mean, I guess I learn a lot. There's a selfish element, I think, as well, because when you want to be a journalist, I think that there is a kind of, there's two ways I look at it. I think there's a part of me which is that views journalism and the practice of journalism and what it means to be a journalist as a kind of as a service to other people, in that you're tasked with the responsibility of telling someone else's story or telling the story of a place, and that's a really significant responsibility. It's can feel like a very weighty responsibility sometimes. Yeah. And that's why a lot of people say, and I feel it too, that it feels like an honor to be a journalist and to write about a place for other people, because that place, whether they know it or not, is entrusting you to be as accurate and as truthful, and to capture the nuance and the shade of a place as best as you can. And so that's a kind of, I guess, one way in which I view journalism. There's this kind of external dimension to it, where you're doing something for someone else and for on behalf of other people. But I think I wouldn't be a journalist if there wasn't a selfish element to it as well, because I think that you have to have that if you want to do something. As a job, you kind of have to get something out of it as well. And how it relates to what you were just talking about is that I think you, as well as learning about myself through music, you learn about yourself through interacting with people and interviewing people. And I think you can see parts of yourself in the stories that other people tell to you, or sometimes people can kind of give you nuance about something that you didn't know about yourself through telling their own story to you. Yes. So I think perhaps that's why I recoil slightly, because both of them kind of give that to me. They both define me in a way.
Yes. Yeah. And also the self-interest, not just about learning about yourself through other people, but also being the witness of important events
100%,
in person.
100%.
That's also another self-interest element to it.
Absolutely. I think that's been something that's very a profound experience for me being in Taiwan, especially because I think when I moved to Taiwan, as I mentioned earlier on, it does feel like quite a significant and important time to be there. Although I've only been there for 3 years, speaking to people who are kind of more veterans or old hands of being in Taiwan, it does feel like there's more urgency around what's happening in Taiwan at the moment. And I remember when I moved to Taipei and I landed, and it was only about 2 days. I landed about 2 days before the election was happening, and I was suddenly given this opportunity to write for the New Statesman on the election. And I remember finding it, going to some of the rallies and the kind of both main political parties, the rallies in Taipei in the kind of days before the election, and just feeling quite moved, honestly, quite moved and emotional about what I was seeing. Because I think that the December prior to that had been the general election in the UK, and I felt quite disillusioned with British politics at that point. I was interested, but I wasn't engaged with any of the leaders or any of the debates. It just felt really stale, and like people didn't care probably isn't the right word, but I just felt quite disillusioned with British politics. And going to Taiwan and seeing how engaged people are, because there is in a sense more at stake in Taiwan. The existential crisis that people face in Taiwan, it adds a level of emotion and complexity to how people view politics there. There is something, unlike perhaps in the UK where we're not threatened by another country per se. There's a very profound sense when you're in Taiwan and talking to people that all of this, especially at kind of voting scenarios or polls, local elections, there's a very profound sense that all of this could be taken away. And so that is, it can be a very moving thing to witness. And I definitely had a kind of renewed sense of my kind of own sense of the importance of democracy writ large, for example, by seeing that. So yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
Witnessing.
And do you think that high stake atmosphere in Taiwan in politics kind of make you feel that your words, spoken or written, matter more and make you more fulfilled because you know that people will read it and think and feel impassioned by it?
Maybe. Do you mean in a personal sense, or?
Yeah, in a personal sense, yeah.
Yeah, I guess because my knee-jerk reaction to that question was I haven't worked in another place, so I don't know what it feels like in that way to report from another place. And but I guess it's a really complex one, like in relation to Taiwan, because there's a real movement and there's a right movement away from trying to talk about Taiwan purely in the context of for example, this kind of grand geopolitical systemic tussle between the US and China, which is I don't know whether it's unfortunate, it's just because that's what people want to know about. That's what feels like of global importance, is how you end up kind of attacking questions and how you end up going about reporting things. And so whilst I try and make not everything about that and trying to diversify, especially in the job I have at the moment, try and diversify the types of stories and the types of voices you hear about from Taiwan, there is still quite a profound sense, I think, that I'm at the same time that exists and that way of viewing Taiwan exists. I also do subscribe to the idea that it is of global importance. The kind of the continuation of Taiwan's democracy and the way Taiwan currently exists is of global importance for how the rest of this century, goes forward. It's really about it's about how people relate to power. It's how people relate to governments. It's whether we're happy with the idea that, or first of all, one country can impose its will on 24 million people who view themselves and view their identity in a different way. There's that dimension to it as well, but it kind of runs deeper than that. It's about how people relate to power and what we're comfortable foregoing in relation to our kind of governments.
Yeah. When you were just starting out as a journalist and writing about politics, was there a sense of not fear, maybe fear, or I guess apprehension about holding people in power to account with your words?
As in a fear that I wouldn't do it well enough,
or
just the act of doing it.
The fear of actually doing it and confronting people in power with your words and articles.
I think there's a number of ways of answering this. I think no, in the sense that when you're a young freelance journalist, you kind of just have to do stuff and not be too worried about. I mean, within reason, obviously, you want to do a good job and do the story justice. But I think if you retreated too much into those very kind of existential questions, you might not ever kind of get anything published. So I think there was a kind of just, okay, I want to do this, and I need to get things published. So I'm not going to be worried about, these really, really kind of big systemic questions whilst I'm going about doing that kind of thing. But of course, with Taiwan and then the problems and the difficulties it faces, given the might, the size of something like the Chinese Communist Party, you naturally think about it, of course. Taiwan, it's been a really fascinating time to be there, because there are a lot of people who have either been kicked out of China or have moved to Taiwan because they can't get journalist visas renewed, or it's just become too difficult to operate within China. And so you inevitably think about that type of thing, because it's, how can I, the question then becomes, how do I hold the Chinese Communist Party, this enormous political machine, to power? And I think it's, you have to think about it in that way to a certain extent, but I think you also kind of have to just get the story out as well. It's part and parcel of it. I think you can't be intimidated by the size of it, but just by doing it, you kind of are speaking to that question as well.
When people ask me what I do for my job and what I want to be in the future, I'm still young enough for people to ask me that. Not soon though. But when I say journalist, I have this quiet, I guess, anxiety when I say journalist, that I think that the other person who asked me has this quiet expectation that I should know everything in the world.
Yeah.
Because as journalists, we deal with information all the time. It's our job.
Yeah.
So I have this really weird expectation of myself that I should know everything that happens now and also in the past as well.
And in the future.
And in the future too. Yeah, exactly. So it becomes really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I soothe myself by saying it's impossible to know everything. Absolutely impossible. Do you have...
Also, if you knew everything, the role of the journalist would cease to exist.
Exactly.
So I know exactly what you mean. I think about the same thing, especially in somewhere, again, it's difficult for me because I really have only operated properly from Taiwan. And I think the anxiety people have there, I guess it's not an anxiety, it's just the difficulty of working there. There is so much historical context and legislative context to the situation in Taiwan and how it's ended up how it is today. And to a large extent, you actually do have to just be on top of that. You do just have to know it.
Yes.
And so that can be intimidating. And I think it can make people apprehensive about starting off in somewhere like Taiwan, because you kind of just do have to know it, because it's not extraneous information. It still colors and shades everything that happens today. But conversely, I think you have to hold that in your mind, but at the same time recognize that you're a vessel for information as well, and you receive things. You're meant to receive things. You're not meant to know everything. You have to draw information out of people and out of situations. And if you knew everything about a certain situation, I feel like you would approach interviews and approach speaking to people in a different way. So I think there's something quite comforting and something quite important about what's the word? A certain degree of deference to a subject or a context or someone's story that you have to approach everything you do with. You can't in a sense think you know everything.
Yeah.
Because it can be a recipe for disaster as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you think you know more than the interviewee, there's this risk of assumption, and that affects the way you approach the interview.
Yeah.
And you don't go from the basics
Right.
and ask the things that where there's no assumption involved.
Right.
You go from the ground up. Yeah. There can be that risk as well.
And you also have to relay information in a non-expert way, which can often, that's something I think people, for example, in Taiwan have to do quite often. They have to kind of check themselves after a certain period of time, because after you're there for a while, you kind of get on top of the history. And I think it's really easy to forget what people don't know about somewhere like Taiwan, because you become so engrossed in the history and the cross-strait situation, and you know about how it ended up how it is and all that kind of thing. It can be really easy to just assume way too much. So I think it's good to sit in the comfort of knowing that you don't know everything.
Yes.
In a way, I think it can make you a more powerful and a more effective journalist in a way, actually.
Exactly.
If you do that. Yeah.
Who taught you everything you know about journalism, or what taught you everything you know at this current moment in your life?
That's actually something I think about quite a lot, because I don't think in speaking with a lot of other journalists, I think it's quite common for people, especially if people have studied at journalism school, to have a very kind of concrete sense of who their quote unquote mentor is. And I've never really had that in a very kind of concrete way, in a very kind of structured way.
Yeah.
I've also never been to journalism school. Everything I've done has been quite, I guess, driven by myself and just my sense of how things should work, just through reading other people's work and watching a lot and reading a lot. I think now I've started this job at a broadcaster called Taiwan Plus. I think there's been greater scope for developing those types of relationships about journalism and getting a kind of more fleshed out and comprehensive way of viewing this profession and how you go about doing it. I don't, because I just started freelancing from in Taiwan, and I'd just done a bit of student journalism before. I felt like it was probably a bit of an insecurity of mine to begin with in the first kind of few months and maybe even a year or so of doing freelancing, that I wasn't equipped enough to do this. Like, I didn't have a kind of robust enough training to do this. But I think it's the thing I rely on, I guess, is that I think journalism is also something in which you're developing relationships with people all the time, and becoming curious in people and seeing people for their tensions and their contradictions, and trying to draw that out and make sense of that. And I think that's what I kind of try to do with people anyway. Yeah. It's not kind of circumscribed to when I put my journalist hat on in the morning and think, okay, now I'm a journalist. I'm going to view the world or treat people in my journalist way and then take off my hat at the end of the day. It's just kind of blends into how I view and navigate the world generally.
It's a 24/7 job.
It is.
That's so interesting, because I feel the exact same way. I've had this conversation with myself many times, that every social interaction, doesn't matter if it's for work or for pleasure, even if it was with friends or mutual friends, that sort of journalist hat maybe, or maybe journalist veneer is always on. And I'm always looking for new connections or practicing ways to open people up in a safer environment over a coffee, for example. Totally. So everything I do, it's in that journalistic essence.
Yeah.
Drawing somebody out and getting someone's story out. And it sometimes happens without even me knowing. It's just a natural way.
I mean, it's probably part of your nature as a human being.
Yeah.
Which is probably what makes you well suited to this job.
Yeah.
I think so much of the more kind of what I view as the more the deeper understanding, for example, I feel like, or the particular understanding I've arrived at of a place like Taiwan is 75% driven by my friends and the people I've interacted with in a non-journalistic context. It's it's not. I don't. It's impossible to divide it up. Really, it wouldn't. It almost would be you wouldn't be doing the job properly. Weirdly, if you felt like you had to do the job at a certain point.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's most of the kind of more profound and the kind of deeper, as I said, the kind of deeper, more fleshed out understanding I have of Taiwan as a place is driven by the people I've met, my friends, people I've met in my time there.
And it's a good excuse to say, I'm going out to socialize for work.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
It is for kind of work. It's building up your, I guess, ammo pack of stories and connections.
Yeah. I think you have to guide people a lot through words and through conversation. There's something very active about, I mean, I guess maybe this is a type of putting your journalist hat on, but there is a way of actively navigating and conducting a conversation which draws information. That sounds very cold and callous, but that draws insight and things people might not necessarily share out of people, that requires a kind of active conversational style, but you're kind of guiding people, I find, a lot. You're navigating people through a conversation, and I mean, that's why there is such a responsibility built into that job, because you can lead people in conversations. You can direct the way a conversation goes, and the way this sounds really sinister, but you can direct the way that people tell their own story in a way. So it's really important to do it in a sensitive way.
Yes,
I think. Yeah,
and respectful too.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, because that you can frame a certain question or use a very specific word to elicit a certain response. Yeah. Well, we're approaching near the end of the episode. I wish we could talk for much longer. Because we both study music, and I have this weird obsession with relating unrelated things together and seeing connections, because it's my way of understanding the world better.
Yeah.
Because if I know how this works and I can relate it to something else, I can understand how that works much quicker. The reason I asked that is because transitioning from music to journalism, I saw very, very similar ideas in between. And I wondered if you saw any connections between, let's say, being a musician studying music and journalism, the practice of journalism, compared with, and when I say studying music, I mean actually practicing music. So, in other words, do you see any connection with practicing an instrument, studying music, and the practice of journalism, writing and...
I'm interested to hear how what connection you see.
Well, I think
I need a prompt for that question.
Sure. Well, I think the most obvious one would be, to me, the idea of practicing and analyzing structure of a piece of writing and a piece of music.
Right.
Because, for example, let's say you're practicing a Mozart sonata and you're analyzing how the piece develops from the exposition to the development and then to the recap. And when you see how the nuggets of ideas develop along the way, and you know how that works, when you read a piece of art, when you read an essay, for example,
Yeah.
and you see how the idea is presented in the first paragraph,
Yeah.
how it's fleshed out in the succeeding paragraphs, and you have a little coda at the end to tie up the article, these things become a lot more easier to understand, and it really influences the way you structure your pieces.
Yeah.
You start to think of your essay forms as a little sonata.
Yeah.
You know, like your
Gosh,
argument.
I'm getting PTSD from my first year musical analysis classes.
I'm sorry to bring this up again.
No,
but
I know exactly what you mean.
When you start to read articles in this way, having studied music,
Yeah.
it informs the way you write things as well, and you become a lot more conscious with where you put information,
Yeah.
how you use words. Should I use this word here, or
How
should
you
I save it for
introduce information as well.
exactly? And should I use this word for later? Would
Yeah.
Would you?
Yeah,
agree with
absolutely.
that?
I think it's oh yeah. I mean, music's an art of repetition. It's about, in so many ways, it's about how we say, if you think about how an idea, as you were just saying, develops through a piece of music, it's about how can I dissect this idea? How can I say it in a different way? How can I frame it in a different way? How can I trigger memory through this particular idea? And so I think, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about these analysis classes I had whilst I was at university, and like the exam we had to do when I was at university, which was basically opening a score and writing an essay on it in 3 hours with no sound.
Yeah.
And there is something about that, what doing that does in terms of your capacity to draw out structure and make sense of seemingly complex information and produce narrative through it, where textually and linguistically there's no narrative. I think especially in terms of instrumental music, which is actually a lot of the analysis I did when I was at university, there is something about that kind of capacity to formulate narrative and story from something that in a sense has nothing there. That I think aids in some ways journalism and crafting a story, for example. I mean, there's so many other ways. Another way I've noticed is, I mean, I think the idea of repetition is important, because I think you start to see how an idea for one person or a concept develops over time, and it becomes shaped by different people, and how it can still appear in one certain way for one group of people, and how it might shift it for someone else. And that is in some ways a lot of where like the tension lies in life and in stories and concepts. So being perceptive to that kind of thing, I think really is beneficial. But I mean, I think it's funny. I think it does, an education in music does it benefit and aid in ways that I didn't necessarily expect, especially since I've started doing broadcast journalism. Even in the way I have to voice my reports, I have to narrate my reports, and I found I have a kind of I can narrate something with cadence and structure with perhaps more ease than someone who hadn't studied music might be able to, because it's something quite bodily, actually. I think it's something where you just kind of feel tension and release, and it's like consonance and dissonance. You feel it in text and word, and it performing that and being sensitive to that is very similar to narrating in a way, a textual report where you have to emphasize certain things, you have to give way at certain points, there's a fluidity to it as well that comes from that kind of education.
And knowing which words to emphasize in
completely
in a sentence.
It's cadential. It's like cadence structure.
Yeah.
Do you rise at the end of a sentence? Do you have a perfect cadence?
Yep.
Do you put an interrupted one in? It's that kind of sensation. It's you're like performing. You're leading someone through a story. You're guiding someone through it, and so you have to be sensitive to that kind of thing. You know, how people respond to text, how people respond to ideas, and kind of preempt that and and structure your thoughts and your sound, and with that in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just going to ask the final question now. If there is one thing that you want to improve in your life that is otherwise holding you back to be at your full potential, sometime in the future or even imminently, what would that one thing be that's holding you back from being your full potential that you wish to improve?
That's such a hard question to answer. I mean, I wish I bit my nails less. I need to stop doing that. That's one thing I need to stop doing. I think in a more kind of a more profound answer, I think, is having more. I remember before I started this job at Taiwan Plus, I had a quite strong anxiety about, for example, the sound of my own voice, and the idea of other people hearing my voice, both in a very literal sonic way, but also in terms of the content I'm saying, and being able to articulate myself in a way that I felt gives justice to the ideas I have in my head. And I think, for example, that was why I think this is an ongoing thing, because I think when we did that interview for the Times, that was actually quite a significant moment for me, because, as I've mentioned to you, that was the first live radio interview that I'd ever done. And it's something I think maybe 2 years ago I would have struggled to do, because it tugs and pulls at some of those insecurities and anxieties I had about myself, in the literal sense, about the sound of hearing my own voice and other people hearing my voice, but also knowing that I can communicate effectively and articulately and eloquently, because I think that I don't think I necessarily had that beforehand, in a kind of perhaps a more imperceptible way. I knew I had it in me is a way of putting it, but that I think that's something everyone wants to be able to feel like they can do, to communicate themselves in a way that does justice to how they feel inside and the way they view the world. So I guess it's an ongoing thing, but something I will be trying to craft and perfect even more as I go forward.
Well, you're still very young, James. You have time. Well, James, Jason, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.